We are making the Syd Tie dress today, and this pattern is super versatile because you can do a dress, you can do a top, you can do sleeves, you can do no sleeves, and sort of mix and match what elements that you want. So today we're doing the dress with no sleeves. If you want to do a top or sleeves, those elements are outlined in the other video tutorial. I had to split them up into two. So if you're doing either of those, I will link the other video in the description so you can jump over there. But today we're doing a dress with no sleeves. At the beginning of the tutorial, I'm going to walk you guys through cutting all the pattern pieces and how you mark certain things. Most of it is normal markings like notches. There's a couple things that are a little bit different. So that's outlined in the instructions, and I also will walk through it at the top of this tutorial here. For full disclosure, I did make a couple little mistakes and ran into some things I needed to troubleshoot. So I'm just gonna sort of keep it in and show you guys how I cut my fabric. And a reminder, if you haven't printed your pattern yet, make sure that you're printing it using the layers function in Adobe, which is outlined in the instructions, and I also have a tutorial on that as well. But this pattern, especially with all the different notches and markings, it's very, very helpful to only be seeing your specific size. If you're making this as a beginner, maybe it's the first thing you've ever made, I'm so excited for you. It's gonna turn out so cute, and I've got your back. We're gonna walk through everything. Let's do it. I always start cutting my fabric with the widest pattern piece, which in this case was the bottom tier of the skirt. And you'll see I immediately ran into an issue where my fabric was just not wide enough for the pattern piece, which is totally fine and normal. In fact, you'll see on the size chart, for most sizes, the 44-inch wide fabric is not going to fit this bottom tier. So I had to troubleshoot a little bit, and we'll get to that next. But in the meantime, I jumped ahead to the first tier of the skirt. This pattern piece is cut on the fold, and we need two of them, so I've obviously folded my fabric over. I've also lined up the grain line to run parallel to the selvage edge of the fabric. And then this pattern piece has two notches, one of which is at the pocket height and one is at the bottom of the skirt. And I mark my notches just by doing a teeny little snip with my rotary cutter. You should also be marking notches at the fold line, so at the bottom of the skirt and the top of the skirt, just do a little teeny snip on the fold. So what I'm going to do to fix the bottom tier is I'm going to, instead of cutting two pieces on the fold, I'm going to cut four separate pieces and then sew them together. So in order to do that and maintain all the correct proportions, I need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to one edge because I'll need to sew that edge together. If that doesn't make a ton of sense to you, don't worry about it. I'm sure this is not something that you need to worry about, but you will see that center seam on my tier that probably won't be on your tier. And just to reiterate, most fabrics that you're going to use, you won't have this problem because there are 3 standard widths of fabric. This fabric is a 44-inch wide fabric, which is typically for like quilting. Usually apparel fabric is wider. So this shouldn't affect most sizes, but a few of the sizes it does. And again, those are outlined on the size chart. So I've cut my 4 pieces of the bottom tier. For you, it will be 2 pieces on the fold. Keep in mind there is a notch on the top end of the skirt, and also mark your notches on the fold once again. For the bodice and the pockets, I had to play a little bit of Tetris to use up as much fabric as possible, and I did make another little mistake here. So the bodice has 2 cut lines. One is the long cut line for a top, one is the short cut line for a dress, and that is marked on the pattern piece. I completely missed it because I wasn't thinking about it. So I accidentally cut the bodice long for a top, but you'll see I'll go back and fold it so that it is the dress length. There are also 4 notches on this front bodice piece. So there are 3 notches in the center front, and then there's 1 notch on the arm side. So make sure you don't miss those. And then you also need to mark your dart. The easiest way that I have found to do this is to mark it with a Hera marker, which is this little plastic tool that if you run it along the lines on the fabric, kind of press into it, it will put a little crease into your fabric so that you can easily see the marking without using any chalk or ink or anything. I can see the dart markings quite well just by using the Hera marker, but because this is a tutorial and the point is for you guys to be able to see it, I also went back through with a little purple marker and marked that dart line so that you guys can see it more easily. For the second front bodice piece, I did cut the length correctly, thank goodness, and I marked all those same notches that we went over, and I also do a couple little notches at the end of the dart point. That just helps me line it up a little bit better, but it is optional. And also the bodice and the pocket are both mirrored, so make sure when you cut multiples that they are like facing opposite directions. And specifically for the pockets, you need 4 pockets mirrored, so 2 of each. The back bodice also needs to be cut at that shorter bodice line for the dress, which you'll see I folded mine back. And I prefer to have the entire pattern piece and just fold it back as opposed to cutting it, because then I can use the same piece whether I'm doing a top or a dress. I don't need to print multiple. There are 4 notches on this pattern piece. There's one on the side seam that will mark where the dart lines up from the front bodice. Then there's a notch on the arm side, which is actually 2 notches. That's important to do both of them. And then there are 2 notches on the fold line, both on the top and the bottom there. And you need 1 back bodice on the fold. As I'm cutting out my final pocket pieces, I feel like this is a good time to mention I don't want you to stress out too much about finding the absolute perfect optimal cutting layout. As you can tell, I sort of just go with the flow and play a bit of Tetris, figure things out, see where things will fit to use the least amount of fabric possible, and I almost never have issues, but it's always a good idea to buy a little extra just in case you make mistakes like I have been making mistakes as I'm cutting. All right, moving on to the ties, we are going to find a 45-degree angle in the fabric, which means it will be cut on the bias. And for the ties and bindings of this pattern, they're cut on the bias to give them a little bit of extra stretch, which you'll need in construction. And then because I know I need 4 ties for my dress and each tie is 1.5 inches wide, I am going to cut a 6-inch wide block and then cut the strips out from there. And the measurements of the ties are included in the instructions. If you'd rather not print that piece out, you can just measure the rectangles. For my armhole binding and the main binding, I'm going to cut them from a different fabric, mainly because I want you to be able to see as we're constructing those pieces kind of what's going on better, and I think with the main fabric it would be too confusing. So we're cutting from a different fabric, and you can see I cut 2 and then laid them on top of each other, right sides together, so that I can mark the notches, because the armhole binding and the main binding both are meant to be mirrored, and so you need the notches to be on mirrored sides, otherwise you're going to run into issues once we're putting this whole thing together. Also, don't forget on your binding piece, there also is a shorter cut line for the dress bodice as opposed to the top bodice. So don't miss that. Make sure you're folding that over. Now, the most unusual marking on this entire pattern comes on the main binding piece, and it is the little triangles that look like 2 pieces of pizza next to each other. That is going to mark your mitered corner. Don't worry too much about what it is yet, we'll get to it, but you need to mark it with a hero marker or chalk or something. So it's not to cut, do not cut those lines. I go in with my hero marker, same like we did with the darts, and I am just going to like rub a crease on top of it to mark those. And again, I did mark it with my purple marker as well so that you guys can see it better, but you need those 3 lines transferred onto your bindings. Now that everything's been cut, let's recap loosely in order of how big the pieces are. So you need 2 of your bottom tier pieces cut on the fold, 2 of your top tier pieces also cut on the fold. You need 1 back bodice piece cut on the fold, 2 front bodice pieces mirrored, 4 pocket pieces also mirrored, 4 ties, 2 armhole bindings mirrored, and 2 main bindings also mirrored. Yay! Okay, it's time to actually sew some things. I hope your back doesn't hurt too much from bending over your table or your floor and cutting all of your fabric. First off, we are going to stay stitch the curves of the bodice pieces, and this will just help in construction that they don't get stretched out, which can cause gaping. So what you want to do is lower your stitch length to 2 millimeters, and then you're going to go along the curves in this order. So you'll start up at the shoulder and then go down along the curve. On the neckline, that will be going down toward the center front, and then on the arm sides, that will be starting at the shoulder and going down to the underarm area. And repeat this on both pieces of your front bodice and also on your back bodice. And you'll see that on the back bodice, in the neckline, the stitches will come and meet at the middle, but don't continue it back up the other side. So start at the shoulder, go down, and stop at the center back. Now to sew the dart, we are going to line up those dart markings by folding your front bodice right sides together. This is why I find it quite helpful to mark those little notches at the end of your dart markings. That just makes it easier to find where they line up. So I usually line those up first, and then I find where the markings come to a point, line those up, and then sew along that line. Start your stitch at the side seam and backstitch as normal, and then when you sew up to the point, don't backstitch, cut yourself some really long tail threads and then double knot them, and that will help your dart not to have any weird bulking. Amazing. Now repeat all of the steps that we just did on the dart on the other side of your bodice, and then press the darts downward. Now you're going to take your back bodice piece and lay it out flat, and then lay the front bodice pieces on top, right sides together, and pin them at the shoulders. We're going to stick these shoulders together with a simple straight stitch at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then we're also going to finish these raw edges with either a serger or a zigzag stitch. I have a serger, I love my serger, but it's not necessary. If you don't have one, you can definitely just finish them with a normal zigzag stitch. Press those shoulder seams toward the back bodice, and then we are going to do basically the same process to the side seams. So pin them together, matching up the dart with the notch on your back bodice, and then you're going to straight stitch again at a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish those raw edges. Now that your bodice is starting to take shape, we are going to set it aside and start working on the ties. So the ties are folded like bias tape, which if you're unfamiliar, you first fold them in half, and then you take your raw edges and fold them toward the middle, and then fold them in half again so that all the raw edges are enclosed inside. So the way that I like to do my ties, and I would recommend it, is to do it 2 at a time, so that when you do one fold on the first tie, you can move to the second tie while the first tie cools down, because there's a lot of steam and heat happening here. And I find that it goes pretty quick if you do it this way. Even though we're only doing 4 ties for the dress, if you were to do more ties either for a dress or a top, I feel like folding the ties is very calming, therapeutic, and it does go pretty quickly. Now I leave the edges of my ties raw, and I've made hundreds of ties at this point on varieties of fabrics, and they fray a teeny bit, but hardly at all. And in my opinion, it's just not worth the effort of closing them when it really doesn't make much of a difference. So we're going to edge stitch along the long edge of these ties. And one hack that I find that makes it a little bit easier is to chain stitch instead of starting and stopping and cutting your thread after each tie. So what you'll want to do, or what my machine does, every machine is different, but what you'll do is when you get to the next tie, you kind of slide the other one under by lifting up your presser foot a little bit. And I find that it very much helps to start your needle maybe like 1/2 centimeter into the tie and backstitch a little bit. That way the feed dogs pick up the tie a little bit easier. What you'll be left with is a big long chain of ties, and then you can individually snip them apart, and you'll be left with 4 very nicely done ties. At this point, you want to attach your ties to your bodice. You can either pin them or baste stitch them. I usually just pin mine in place for the time being, and you want to line them up with the top 2 notches on your bodice. All right, time to jump into the binding. So you want to lay your 2 bindings on top of each other, right sides together, and make sure that the notches are all aligned because, again, your binding pieces should be mirrored. And then you're going to stitch on the notched short end of the binding at just a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Not 3/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch. Press that center seam flat, and then I want you to find the long end of the binding that does not have notches on it. So you'll see one side will have the notches and the other side does not. We are going to fold up the unnotched side a 1/4 inch. I'm pretty good at eyeballing it, but it's always a good idea to double check your folding measurement, especially on a small pattern piece like this where like every millimeter counts. Now we get to start my favorite part of the entire pattern, which is the mitered corner. So you see you have the 3 lines, 2 are diagonal, 1 is straight across. Fold your binding in half, right sides together along that straight horizontal line, and then we're going to stitch on the diagonal line. Do a really good job back stitching, and then repeat this process on your other mitered corner of your binding. What you'll end up with is this squared off U shape that comes to 2 right angles at those mitered corners, and we're going to press this little triangle of seam allowance here down toward what is going to be your neckline. We're about to do some magic. Get ready to feel really cool in like 5 minutes. So what I want you to do is attach this binding to the center front and neckline. Don't worry too much about the neckline yet. We're going to pin the center front first and then get to the neckline later. So start by pinning at the mitered corners, which should line up perfectly with the top neckline corners of your bodice. And then the notches should line up with where your ties are and where the notches are in your bodice. I want to mention here, because this binding is cut on the bias, there could be some stretching happening with all the ironing and sewing and whatnot. So if your binding ends up a little bit long here in the center front part, don't worry too much. It's okay if it hangs over a little bit. Try to squish it in as best you can, but don't stress about it. Once the binding is pinned to your center front, you are going to move along and pin it to your neckline next. Now, the important part to remember about this is that you want to match up the notches and shoulder seams first. So I like to pin the center back notch first and then the shoulder seams to those appropriate notches. And then from there, because the bias binding is a little bit stretchy, you are going to have to stretch it just a tad to fit around this neckline. And if you didn't, if it was just a straight non-bias piece of fabric, it would stretch the neckline out and make it look really like weird, and it would stand up funny and it would kind of gape a little bit. So it does stretch on purpose and you want it to stretch. Okay, amazing. Now that we have that all pinned in place, we are going to stitch the entire binding in place at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. One quick tip for this section, I also backstitch over my ties. So I'll go over them, backstitch over them, and then continue forward again so they get 3 rows of stitches, just to give them a little bit of extra security because I don't want them falling out. So the center front was pretty straightforward because it was just a straight line. But now we are going to pick our presser foot up and pivot once we get to that mitered corner line, and we are going to start going around the neckline. So you'll notice with the neckline, you'll see a little bit of bunching. That isn't really going to affect what you're stitching. Your stitch should not have any gathers or bunches in them at all, but you do have to, like we talked about, stretch your bias binding a little bit and kind of just make sure that whatever is directly under your needle is flat, that there's no bunching or gathering there. But you may see folds around your needle. As long as it's not directly under your presser foot, you're totally fine, and don't worry about it until it gets right up under your needle. Continue that stitch all the way through the other side of your binding, and then when you're finished, take it off your machine and you are going to cut off the bulk around the mitered corners, because when you turn it inside out, you don't want all that extra seam allowance in the way. So trim it like so and then poke your corner out. I use the blunt end of my scissors just when they're closed to kind of give it that nice little point. Great. Okay, look how cute it's looking already, and I love this contrasting binding. Okay, next we are going to press flat that binding, and I really take my time with this step. I use my fingers to kind of roll that seam a little bit so that it's lying exactly flat on the seam. And similar to when we pinned and stitched this binding in place, around the neckline it can be a tad trickier just with the curve and the stretch factor and all of that. But once again, if you kind of focus on the points of the shoulder seams and the center back, do those areas first and then kind of fill in the middle, it can be a little bit easier. And don't stress too much about it, because really not until you stitch the binding in place is when you need to be a perfectionist. But before we top stitch that binding down, we are first going to sew a stitch up along this bottom of the center front. We're just going to stitch up to the 3rd notch. So this will close that center front seam up just a bit, and up to the 3rd notch is about like the mid bust area, but it's adjustable. If you want it to be higher or lower or whatever your preference is, you can adjust it. So I'd recommend maybe stitching it up to the 3rd notch, and then maybe you can try it on, see if you want to adjust it from there, or you can just wing it if you want to. It's an easy thing to unpick. So my middle pin there is where I've marked my 3rd notch. That's where I'm going to stop my stitch. And I'm going to stitch right alongside, like just a hair away from the existing stitch line. And you want to do it on the bodice side of the stitch, and you'll see why when we kind of unopen it. But try to get as close as you can to that stitch without overlapping, or definitely not going over to the other side. When you do unfold it, you'll see here, we're looking at the inside of the bindings. You'll see that you have a nice, neat little seam running up the center that combines the front bodices. And again, this is a great place to try it on and just double check that you like where that's placed. Press that binding flat again, and now you are ready to top stitch the binding in place. So we are just going to do a stitch right along the edge of this binding, and try to stay as consistent as you can with the seam allowance, because from the inside, right, that we're looking at, you will just see the stitch along the binding, but from the opposite side, you won't see the binding, it's invisible, so you will only be able to see your stitch. And likely, depending on the fabric and thread you're using, the stitch will basically be invisible. You won't be able to see it too far away, but if it is really uneven, it will be very noticeable from the outside. Amazing. And I like to give my binding a little bit of a press here, just because sometimes things get a little wonky in the sewing process. So I like to press it so it's nice and even. And then I also tie my ties here, partially because it's fun and cute, and partially because it gets them out of the way as we're going to do the armhole bindings next. Next, we're going to grab that armhole binding and find the long edge that does not have any notches on it. So here you can see the notches are along the top edge. So we are going to press up that bottom edge 1/4 inch. And again, since this is a small binding, be very careful not to overdo that fold. Then you're going to stitch together the two short ends at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and make sure that you're unfolding the 1/4 inch that we just pressed up when you stitch it together. Then you're going to press that seam open flat, and then repress the bottom 1/4 inch fold across the entire binding. As we go to pin that binding to the armhole, keep an eye out for the notches. So on one side of the binding will be a single notch, and on the other side will be a double notch. The single notch is going to be aligned with the notch on the front of your bodice, and the double notch will be aligned with the double notch on the back of your bodice. There's also going to be a notch that will align with your shoulder seam. So the 4 places that you want to line up are the side seam, the front notch, the shoulder seam, and the back notch. And once you have those all pinned in place, then it becomes really easy to pin in between those spots. And again, because this is a bias binding, it is going to stretch a little bit. Again, you want it to stretch. That will prevent gaping. Once that's all been pinned together, you're going to stitch it in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, really try to stick to a 1/4 inch. If you make it much bigger, it's going to make the turning process a bit of a headache. And I'm actually going to remove this piece of my sewing machine that pops off. I think it is intended for armholes in situations like this, but just with this small space that I'm working with, it is extra helpful to be able to remove that. Your sewing machine might have something similar. We're going to finish this armhole binding in the same way that we did the neckline. We're just going to fold over that binding on the seam, press it in place, and then top stitch it along its edge. Once that's done, your bodice is completely finished and you have a cute little crop top type situation. This is a great time to try it on and kind of see how it's fitting, get excited. And now all we have to do is add the skirt. First up, you're going to need to grab your pockets and finish the raw edges. So for me, I do that with my serger. Then you're going to grab one of your top tier skirt panels, and you're going to find the side where there is a little notch, and that is going to dictate where you put your pocket. So start finishing your edge. Again, for me, that's my serger. You could zigzag stitch this instead. And then once you get to that notch, line the pocket up where the notch is, the top of the pocket, and finish the entire side seam, simultaneously connecting that pocket to the skirt. Now we are going to do an understitch on this pocket. So flip your pocket over so it's sort of splayed out, and then we're going to do a straight stitch, kind of like an edge stitch along this side of the pocket, but it's going to also be incorporating the seam allowance that we serged. So in the end, it will look like this, and that will help the pocket stay in place and not roll out of the skirt. Repeat these steps with all 4 pockets and all 4 sides of your skirt tiers, and then we are going to lay them face down, right sides together on top of each other, and pin along the sides, because we are going to do a stitch going down the side through the curve of the pocket and continuing down the other side. So as you can see here, once you get to the curve of the pocket, you will pivot your needle and keep going around the curve, and it's not a huge deal if you accidentally overshoot. Just realign, go back to where you need to go, do a couple back stitches, and keep cruising. Press those seams open flat up to the pocket bag. Obviously you can't press the pocket bag sleeves, but that's fine. Now we're going to move on to our bottom tier. So make sure you finish the side seams of that bottom tier of your skirt, either with a serger or zigzag stitch. And then I also have this funky center seam because my fabric wasn't wide enough. You probably won't have that. Then you're going to take your other bottom tier skirt and lay it on top of this one, right sides together, and pin those side seams. And one thing you want to look out for, there are notches along the top edge of this bottom tier of the skirt. Make sure those are on the same side. Then you'll simply stitch those 2 skirt panels together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and press those seams open flat. Now we are going to gather this bottom skirt tier and attach it to the other skirt tier. So find the top edge of the skirt, the side with the notches, and we are going to start at this side seam. So start your stitch right on top of that seam allowance. And our first stitch is going to be at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we're going to extend our stitch length to 5 millimeters, which is the basting stitch length. Continue that basting stitch all the way around the loop of the skirt until you get back to the side seam that you started from, but don't overlap them, leave a little bit of a gap before you finish it. You also want to leave your tail threads quite long, so don't snip them too short. We're going to go back through and do another row of basting stitches, this time at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and make sure that this stitch does not overlap with the one that you just did. You don't want to cross those tracks. In the end, you should have a side seam that looks like this, with 4 threads coming out of that top layer, 2 starting places and 2 stopping places. Okay, now grab the top tier of your skirt. See, here's where we have the pockets, and we are going to go down to the bottom edge where there are notches. We're now going to take the bottom tier of the skirt and attach it to the top tier of the skirt. So the top tier is on the inside, the bottom tier is on the outside, and we are going to start by lining up the side seams. So take the bottom tier of the skirt, the side seam that you started your basting stitches at, that's what we're going to pin first. So align that up with the side seam of your top tier. And then we're going to continue around the loop of this skirt, matching up notches and side seams. And anywhere where there is a notch or a side seam, I like to put 2 pins. That just helps kind of keep that anchor point firmly in place. So continue lining those spots up, and just another reminder, I do have funky center seams because I had to kind of troubleshoot my narrow fabric. So if you see extra seams, that's why you're seeing them. You won't have them. You will likely just have the 2 side seams, and then the rest will be notches. All right, once you've lined up all of those spots, we are going to gather our basting stitches along the bottom tier of the skirt. Find your side seam where you started your basting stitches, and we are going to start with the 2 top threads that are kind of jutting out to the left. And if you've never done this before, essentially what you do is you hold on to those basting threads, and then you're going to take your fabric and pull. So keep holding onto those threads and just pull your fabric, gather your fabric, keep sliding it, and what we're going to do is slide this fabric all the way around to the other side seam. And because you've kind of sectioned your loop off into all of these different spots with the notches and the side seams, you kind of have quadrants to gather instead of a giant skirt to gather into another big skirt. So once I've gathered 1/2 of my skirt, I usually start by over gathering it a little bit. I then start at the opposite side seam and start working my way backwards and evening out the gathers, kind of going back and forth, making them even, and then pinning them in place quadrant by quadrant. So I started on the left, pulled all the way to the right, and then now that I'm on the right side seam, I'm now going to start working my way backwards and evening things out a little bit, like you can see here. Once I've finished evening out all the quadrants on this half of the skirt, I'll go back to the side seam where we started, where those basting stitches start and stop, and then I will get the other 2 basting stitches going the opposite direction and repeat the whole process, pulling over the other half of the skirt and gathering those quadrants evenly. Alright, now it is time to stitch these gathers in place. So you'll remember our basting stitches are sitting at a 1/4 inch and then 3/8 inch seam allowance, and we are going to stitch the gathers in place at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So all the basting stitches will be in the seam allowance, so we won't need to unpick anything. If you've gathered skirts before, you may have done it in a method where you did 2 rows of basting stitches and then your final stitch was in between the 2 basting stitches, and then you had to go back and unpick the basting so that it didn't show on the front side of your skirt. You can do that method if you want to. I know a lot of people feel like that gives some extra evenness to the gathers. Personally, I find that this method works just as well. I think the gathers are just as even if you're going slow and kind of working with the gathers as you sew them down. But there's no unpicking afterwards, which I despise having to unpick basting stitches. So that is why I've done it this way. It's how I would recommend doing it, but you can do your basting stitches however you prefer. Then you're going to want to finish off this raw edge. And because I'm using my serger, I'm also using the knife on my serger to chop off a bit of this seam allowance and kind of even things out. So if you're using a zigzag stitch, I would recommend maybe trimming off 1/8 of an inch up to maybe a 1/4 inch of the seam allowance, and then doing a zigzag stitch just to kind of keep everything nice and clean. I like to finish off my gathers by pressing them down a little bit. The seam allowance is pressed toward the top tier of the skirt, and I find that this just helps the gathers fall nicely and not be too poofy. To attach your full skirt to the bodice, follow the exact same method that we did for the gathers on the bottom tier of the skirt. You're going to line up notches and center fronts, center backs, side seams, all of those things. Gather the same way that we did before, and then attach it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and give your gathers a press, and then the final thing that we have to do is just hem the dress. So the first thing we're going to do is fold up the hem 3/8 of an inch and give that a press, and then fold it up again 1 inch. And before you stitch this in place, this is a great time to try your dress on, just to kind of see how you're liking the length. You can kind of adjust it a little bit from here if you need to change anything. And if you love the length as it is, go ahead and stitch it down with an edge stitch. And that is it. You just made yourself a cute dress. I hope you feel like a sewing wizard and a mitered corner wizard. Tell me how you liked this dress and let me know what we should make next.